Veteran and loyal dog move into haunted mountain estate. Then hear a woman's breath. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a quiet morning when John, a battle-worn veteran, and his loyal German shepherd, Max, finally arrived at the old mountain estate. Nestled high in the rugged peaks, the mansion seemed as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Its crumbling stone walls and ivy-covered windows told a story of years left untouched by human hands. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds that could be heard were the soft crunching of snow beneath their boots and Max's steady breathing. The estate had been abandoned for decades, but now, after hearing about it from an old friend, John had decided to make it his new home. The isolation was exactly what he needed after years of combat, the silence offering a peace he could not find in the busy cities he had visited. But as they walked toward the large front door, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. The house, though empty, seemed to hum with an energy of its own, as if it had a life hidden beneath its weathered exterior. Max, who was always alert, suddenly froze, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl that seemed to reverberate through the still air. John looked down at his dog, his hand resting on the dog's strong shoulders. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Max's amber eyes were fixed on the old oak door, his body tense, as if sensing something John could not. The hairs on the back of John's neck stood up as he followed Max's gaze. A gust of wind swirled around them, causing the leaves to rustle and sending a chill up his spine. But there was something more. Something about the way the house stood there, imposing and silent, seemed to beckon them inside. As he reached out to open the door, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a soft, slow exhale, like a breath being held just behind the walls. John paused, his hand still on the door handle. Max's growl intensified, his body trembling with unease. "It's nothing, boy. Probably just the wind," John whispered, though even he wasn't convinced. With a push, the door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. The smell of aged wood and dust hit him instantly. But as they stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. John shivered as the chill seemed to settle deep in his bones. Max, however, was not comforted. He stood at the threshold, staring into the darkness of the house, his tail stiff and his stance defensive. As the door slowly closed behind them, John felt a strange sense of being watched. He turned to Max. "Let's explore, boy. Let's see what secrets this place holds." The house was large, its grand staircase winding upward to the second floor, where shadows clung to the walls like forgotten memories. John could hear the sound of his boots echoing through the empty halls. But then, something else. A whisper. Soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind, yet it carried an unmistakable feeling. "Help me," it seemed to say, and then silence. John froze. He looked at Max, whose ears were fully raised, listening intently. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. But Max only responded with a soft whine, his eyes darting around the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the whisper came again, this time clearer, but still faint. "Help me." It was coming from upstairs. Without a word, John started toward the staircase, Max close behind. The house seemed to grow colder as they ascended, the atmosphere thick with an energy John couldn't explain. As they reached the top of the stairs, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind them, making both man and dog jump. The whisper was gone, replaced by a silence that felt almost deafening. John stood in the hallway, his heart racing. Max, still on alert, turned his head toward one of the rooms at the end of the hall. There, in the dim light, something caught John's eye, a reflection in the cracked mirror that hung on the wall. It was the figure of a woman, standing. Behind him, her face pale and blurred, as if she were trapped in time itself. John spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. He felt a chill run down his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. No answer came. The only sound was the steady breathing of Max, who now stood at attention, his eyes locked onto the room in front of them. John swallowed hard. The house, it seemed, was not as abandoned as he thought. As John stood at the top of the staircase, the house around him felt different, colder, heavier. The whisper had faded, but its presence lingered, like a shadow refusing to be chased away. Max stood beside him, his body tense, eyes fixed on the room at the end of the hall. John's heart was pounding now, his breath shallow as the weight of the house's eerie silence pressed down on him. "Who's there?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the only response was the faintest echo of his words. The hallway stretched before them, long and narrow, lined with old portraits whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. The air felt thick, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. He took a step forward, his boots creaking on the old wooden floorboards. Max hesitated for a moment, then trotted ahead, his nose twitching, as if something unseen was pulling him forward. John followed the dog, his hand resting on the railing as they moved deeper into the hallway. The room at the end was the largest in the house, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. The faintest light bled through the crack, a cold, blue glow that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. John's grip tightened on the railing as he approached the door. "Max, stay close," he muttered under his breath. Max let out a soft growl, his tail stiffening, and his ears flicked nervously. John pushed the door open, his heart racing. The room was filled with dust and cobwebs, the furniture draped in white sheets, as though time had frozen here long ago. Yet there was something else, a presence. The room felt alive, as if the walls themselves were watching. At first, it seemed like any other forgotten room in an abandoned house, but then he saw it. The reflection in the large, cracked mirror that hung on the far wall. For a brief moment, he could swear he saw a figure standing in the reflection, a woman dressed in dark, flowing clothing. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes locked with his through the mirror. Max's growl intensified, and John's breath caught in his throat. He turned quickly, but the room was empty. Nothing but dust and forgotten furniture. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. "It's just the mirror," he said, his voice unsteady. Nothing more. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they didn't sound convincing. The room, despite its emptiness, felt more like a trap than a safe haven. Max, as if sensing his unease, stepped forward cautiously. The dog's amber eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where a faint outline of a figure seemed to flicker in the low light. John could feel his pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The figure in the corner was now clearer, though still faint, almost like smoke that couldn't fully take form. Slowly, cautiously, John moved toward it, his feet dragging against the floor as if the house itself were trying to hold him back. The figure in the corner was becoming more solid with every step. It was the woman from the mirror. Her face was now fully visible, her features both beautiful and sad, like someone trapped between life and death. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the fabric dark and tattered, her hair long and flowing like waves of midnight. Her eyes, pale and full of sorrow, locked onto John's, and for a moment, he felt as if she were trying to communicate something desperate. Max, ever the protector, moved to stand in front of John, his body tense, his growl becoming more pronounced. The air in the room grew even colder, a bone-chilling frost that seemed to settle in the very walls. "What do you want?" John whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman's lips parted, and for a moment, John thought she would speak. But instead, she simply reached out a hand, her fingers trembling, as though beckoning him closer. Max barked once, sharply, and the woman's hand froze midair. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and fear before she disappeared in a wisp of smoke, leaving nothing but an empty corner. The room was silent once more, the oppressive cold slowly lifting. John stood frozen in place, his mind racing to process what had just happened. Max sniffed the air, his body still tense, his hackles raised. "What the hell was that?" John muttered, his voice hoarse. The woman, the figure in the mirror. Was it all just his mind playing tricks on him? But deep down, he knew something was wrong with this place. Something far darker than he had imagined. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he turned to leave the room. But as he stepped back into the hallway, the air grew thick once again, heavy with an unseen presence. Max's growl rumbled low in his chest as he walked alongside John, his eyes darting nervously around them. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. The house was now more than just a place to stay. It had become a maze of strange feelings and unexplained phenomena. After the encounter in the room with the mirror, John and Max had retreated to a small, cold room at the back of the house. It was nothing more than a storage area, cluttered with old furniture draped in sheets, boxes of forgotten belongings, and a musty smell that seemed to hang in the air like a warning. John sat on the edge of a dusty old armchair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Max lay at his feet, his eyes never leaving the darkened doorway. The dog's low growl had returned, and it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards with an unsettling rhythm. John stared at the shadows stretching across the room, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something more was at work here. Something that could not be explained away by logic or reason. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee as he thought back to the figure in the mirror, the woman with the pale, sorrowful eyes. Why had she appeared? What was it that she wanted from him? He stood up abruptly, his boots scraping against the floor. Max jumped to his feet, the growl intensifying, and John looked at the dog, his expression hardening. "We need to figure this out, boy," he said quietly. "This house, it's not what it seems." He moved toward the door, and Max followed closely behind, the tension palpable between them. They returned to the hallway, and as they passed the mirror, John hesitated. His reflection seemed normal, just him and Max standing in the dim light. But something caught his eye. The same pale figure from before flashed briefly in the glass. Only this time, her face seemed even clearer. She was standing just behind him, her hand outstretched as if she was reaching for something, or someone. John's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, but the woman was gone. He could feel his chest tightening with anxiety as he took another step forward. It was as if the house itself were alive, breathing with some strange force that didn't want them there. Max, his body rigid with unease, began to walk toward a door at the far end of the hall. John followed, his instincts telling him that they were being led to something important. As they reached the door, a sudden gust of wind blew through the hallway, pushing the door open with a soft creak. Inside, the room was colder than the rest of the house, the temperature dropping as soon as they stepped inside. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of anticipation. Max's ears flicked back, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. There was something in here, something that didn't belong. John could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He walked into the room, his eyes scanning the dark corners. It was another bedroom, though this one felt different, older, more oppressive. The furniture was antique, covered in sheets that looked as though they hadn't been disturbed in decades. The air was stagnant, untouched by time. At the far side of the room, near the window, stood a large wardrobe. John moved towards it, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Max followed closely behind, his tail low, his body tense. John reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cold wood. As he opened it, a sudden chill swept through the room, making him shiver. Inside the wardrobe was a collection of old clothes, faded dresses, jackets, and a few pairs of shoes. But as John moved aside the clothes to examine the back of the wardrobe, something caught his eye. A small, ornate box sat in the corner, hidden beneath the layers of fabric. He reached down and picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and as he held it, he felt a faint pulse of energy running through it. The box was decorated with intricate carvings, symbols that John didn't recognize. His curiosity piqued. He opened it carefully, his breath catching in his throat as the lid creaked open. Inside, there was a small, yellowed piece of paper. As John unfolded it, he could see that it was a letter, written in elegant handwriting. The letter seemed ancient, its paper brittle with age. As he read the words, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. The letter spoke of a woman who had lived in the house long before John had ever set foot inside. Her name was Eleanor, and she had died under mysterious circumstances. The letter hinted at something darker, something that had been hidden in the house for years. Eleanor had been searching for something powerful enough to change the course of her life. But the letter was cut off abruptly, as if someone had torn it in half. John's heart raced as he read the last few lines. "The truth lies beneath the floorboards," it said, "beneath the room where the mirror lies." He looked up sharply. The mirror. He had to go back to the room with the mirror. But before he could make a move, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. He wasn't alone. Max's growl returned, louder now, and John felt his blood run cold. The footsteps were getting closer. John's grip on the box tightened as he turned to face the door, every muscle in his body tense. The house had come alive, and whatever was inside was not about to let them leave. The woman in the mirror was only the beginning. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the long hallway as if they were drawing closer, but there was no one in sight. John's grip tightened on the small, ornate box in his hands. Max's growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards, his eyes fixed on the doorway. John's heart raced. The air in the house had changed again, becoming thicker, colder, and more oppressive. It was as though the very walls were closing in around them, the house itself coming alive with some unseen force. John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He turned, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky but determined. There was no answer, just the ominous sound of footsteps. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound of the footsteps themselves. The hairs on the back of John's neck stood up as the air grew colder still. It was then that Max suddenly stopped growling and stared, unblinking, toward the far end of the hallway. John felt a shiver run down his spine. Something wasn't right. "Stay close, Max," John muttered under his breath as he slowly moved toward the source of the sound. He knew now that this wasn't just a figment of his imagination. The house was hiding something he couldn't yet comprehend. He moved cautiously down the hall, the box still clutched in his hand, feeling the strange energy pulsing from within it. With every step, the feeling of being watched intensified, as though a pair of unseen eyes were following his every movement. The footsteps, though faint, echoed louder as he approached the door to the room with the mirror, the room where it all started. He reached for the handle, but just as his hand touched the cold metal, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, spoke from behind him. "You should not be here." John froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned quickly, but once again, there was nothing there, only the oppressive silence of the house. Max stood motionless, his eyes still fixed on the door ahead. The voice had come from nowhere. It was as though it had come from the house itself, from the very walls. It was a warning. John's mind raced. He stepped back slowly, his hand still on the doorknob. He wasn't sure what to expect, but deep inside, he knew that whatever awaited him in that room, he had to face it. He had no choice. As the door creaked open, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold air biting into his skin. He stepped inside, and Max followed obediently, his ears perked and his body rigid with tension. The room looked exactly as it had before, the large mirror reflecting the dim light, the same oppressive atmosphere hanging heavy in the air. But something had changed. The faint whisper from earlier grew louder, almost as if it were speaking directly to him. John turned to face the mirror. For a moment, he saw only his reflection and Max standing beside him. But then, the image shifted. The woman from the mirror appeared again, her form clearer now than it had been before. She was standing just behind John, her eyes locked onto his with a sadness so deep it was almost suffocating. She reached out once more, her fingers trembling, as though begging him to understand something important. "What do you want from me?" John whispered, his voice barely audible. He felt his heart pounding in his chest as the woman's mouth opened. The whisper from before grew louder, clearer. "The truth lies beneath." John's eyes widened. Beneath? Beneath what? He looked down at the floor beneath the mirror, his mind racing. The house had been hiding something all along, something buried deep beneath its floorboards. He stepped forward cautiously, kneeling beside the mirror and running his fingers along the edge of the frame. The wooden floor beneath him creaked as he moved, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. A faint crack running along the edge of the floorboards, just in front of the mirror. Max let out a low whine, his body tensing. John knew, then, that he had found it. He stood up slowly, looking around the room. The air was thick with the sense that something was waiting to be uncovered. With one final glance at the woman in the mirror, who still looked at him with those pleading eyes, John moved toward the floorboard. He knelt down and ran his fingers along the crack, feeling the cold, ancient wood beneath his touch. Slowly, he pried the floorboard loose, revealing a small, dark space beneath. His heart raced as he pulled the board up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, a dusty old chest lay waiting, its surface covered in cobwebs. John hesitated for only a moment before he opened it. Inside the chest, he found something that made his breath catch in his throat. An old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. He picked it up carefully, the weight of it seeming to draw him in. As he opened the first page, he saw the name written in elegant, faded handwriting, Eleanor, the woman in the mirror. John's hands shook as he began to read. The journal told the story of Eleanor, a woman who had lived in this very house long ago. She had been searching for something powerful, something hidden deep within the walls of the house. But she had never found it before she died. The journal ended abruptly, the last few pages torn out, as though someone had been trying to keep its secrets hidden. But there was enough. Enough to make John realize that the truth was far darker than he had ever imagined. Eleanor's search had never been for treasure. It had been for something much more dangerous. And now, John had found it. The house was not just haunted by a restless spirit. It was haunted by something far worse. Something that had been buried beneath the floorboards for a reason. John's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages of the leather-bound journal. Eleanor's words seemed to leap off the page, each sentence heavy with urgency and a sense of growing fear. She had known something was buried here, something that had to stay hidden, something that could not be allowed to surface. The final pages, torn and missing, only left John with more questions. The last entry, though, sent a chill down his spine. I have found it, but it is not what I expected. It is worse than I could have imagined. I must seal it away, forever. It will not rest until it has found a way out. John swallowed hard, the weight of the words sinking deep into his chest. He looked at Max, whose fur stood on end, eyes darting nervously around the room. The house, it seemed, was not just haunted by a restless spirit. It was haunted by something far darker. Max growled low in his throat, a warning that John could not ignore. The room, though silent, seemed to thrum with a presence, as though the very walls were vibrating with an ancient energy. The journal had confirmed it. The house wasn't just a home to a ghost. It was the prison of something far more dangerous. John closed the journal with a snap, the sound echoing in the silence. He stood up slowly, looking around the room. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on him with an almost tangible weight. The air had grown thick, heavy with an unnatural cold. Max's growl intensified, and John felt the temperature drop even further. He could see his breath misting in front of him. He knew he had to leave the room, but as he turned toward the door, a sudden sound made him freeze. A soft, low whisper, barely audible, seemed to come from behind him. It's too late. John's heart raced. He spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. The whisper had come from the very walls, the very air itself. His mind raced. What had Eleanor been trying to stop? What had she uncovered? He moved quickly, heading toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. Max's growl deepened as they reached the hallway, his body rigid. John didn't want to look back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, something that was not quite human. As they moved further down the hall, the temperature dropped even further. John's breath came out in visible puffs, the chills sinking into his bones. It was then that he heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hall behind him. Max stopped, his ears flicking toward the sound. John's heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were getting closer, and yet there was no one in sight. The air around them grew heavier, thick with an unseen presence. John turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side, though he knew it would do little to protect him from whatever haunted this house. The footsteps were now just outside the door. John held his breath. His eyes darted to the door across from him, the door that led to the basement. He had only seen it briefly, but something about it pulled at him. Max was now beside him, his body low to the ground, his tail stiff. It was as though the dog knew what was about to happen. Slowly, John reached for the door handle. The door creaked open as if it had not been disturbed in years. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of earth, but there was something else, a faint, cold draft that seemed to be coming from below. He stepped inside, Max following closely. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small window near the ceiling, but it was enough to make out the heavy wooden beams and shelves lined with old, forgotten tools. The basement stretched out in front of them, a dark, oppressive space that seemed to swallow up the light. And then, John saw it. An old iron door at the far end of the room, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was unlike anything he had seen before. The door was covered in symbols, strange and unfamiliar, carved deeply into the metal. John's hand shook as he approached it. The air grew even colder as he neared the door. Max whined, pulling back slightly, his body trembling. John could feel it now, the same oppressive presence that had followed him through the house. The door seemed to pulse with an energy, like it was alive. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment his skin made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through him, making his heart race. Max barked sharply, his eyes wide with fear. Something on the other side of the door was awake. John knew he couldn't turn back now. Whatever had been buried beneath this house, whatever Eleanor had tried to stop, was waiting for him, and it was ready to make its escape. With one final look at Max, John grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the darkness beyond. The air seemed to press in around him, thick with the weight of years of secrets and horrors. And then, in the pitch blackness of the room, he saw it, the faintest glimmer of movement. Something was stirring, something old and powerful, something that had been waiting far too long to be freed. As John pushed the door open, a rush of cold air hit him like a wall. The darkness beyond was so thick it seemed almost tangible, pulling at his body, urging him to turn back. Max whimpered at his side, clearly unsettled by the oppressive atmosphere that filled the basement. The air felt charged, as if something unseen was waiting to make itself known. John stood frozen for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, a steady beat that echoed in the silence. And then, from deep within the shadows, he heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. Max's hackles stood on end as the sound grew louder, closer. John's mind raced, his instincts telling him to get out, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. What was waiting for him in that darkness? He took a slow step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. The cold air grew even more intense, as though the very room itself was alive with some malevolent force. Max stayed close, his body stiff with tension. John's hand rested on the wall as he moved deeper into the room, his eyes struggling to adjust to the pitch-black surroundings. Then, suddenly, there was a flicker of movement. John's breath caught in his chest as a faint outline appeared in the darkness, like a shadow shifting just beyond the edge of his vision. He stopped, waiting, his hand gripping the small journal tightly. The movement stopped as well. Silence fell once more. Then, the low, guttural sound broke the silence again. This time, it was closer, too close. Max growled, a deep, primal sound that sent a chill down John's spine. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Whatever it wasn't human. John's fingers tightened around the journal, his mind racing. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever was about to unfold, but he had no choice. He had to see this through. Slowly, he took another step forward. And then, from the farthest corner of the room, came a voice. A soft, haunting whisper. You shouldn't have come. The voice sent a jolt through John, like a shock of electricity running through his body. He froze, his eyes wide as he scanned the darkness. There was no sign of anyone, or anything, yet the voice had been unmistakable, low and menacing. Max's growl deepened. The dog's eyes were fixed on something ahead, his body trembling as though he sensed what John could not. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and John could see his breath now, the mist swirling in the cold air. He clenched his jaw, refusing to show any fear, but deep inside, something twisted. The voice came again, clearer this time, as if it was speaking directly into his mind. It's already too late for you. The shadows in the room shifted. John felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, a fleeting sensation that made his heart skip a beat. He whipped around, but the space behind him was empty. Max barked, his body tense, and John instinctively stepped back, his eyes darting around the room. Show yourself, John demanded, his voice firm despite the fear crawling up his spine. The shadows in the corner began to move, swirling like smoke, coiling around each other until they formed a shape, a figure, vaguely humanoid. John's breath caught in his throat as he saw the form take shape. It was a woman, but her features were blurred, her body shifting in and out of focus. Her eyes, when they locked onto his, were empty, black as the void, devoid of anything human. John's legs almost gave way beneath him, but he stood his ground. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a mix of fear and curiosity. The woman's lips curled into a sinister smile, and her voice filled the room, low and cold. "I am what was buried." John felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. This wasn't just a ghost. It was something older, something that had been buried for a reason. The room seemed to close in on him as the figure drifted closer, her form flickering like a dying flame. Max snarled, stepping in front of John, his fur bristling. But the figure didn't seem to be bothered by the dog. She simply stared at John, her eyes burning with a cold, inhuman intensity. "You should not have opened the door," she whispered. "Now, you must finish what was started." John's mind reeled, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, the walls closing in tighter. The woman stepped forward, her form becoming more solid with every passing second. John reached for his gun, but the cold in the room intensified, making it feel heavier in his hand. The air seemed to be alive with malevolent energy, and John knew, deep down, that he wasn't going to escape without facing whatever had been unleashed. "Finish it," the woman repeated, her voice echoing in his mind. "The truth is waiting beneath the house. You must decide, leave or die." John's pulse raced. He didn't know what to believe anymore, but the presence in the room was undeniable. He had no choice but to continue, no matter what it cost him. John stood frozen, staring at the dark, shifting figure before him. The air in the room was thick with an energy that made it feel like every breath he took was a struggle. Max growled low, his fur standing on end, his body rigid with tension. The woman's eyes, those deep, empty pits, never left him. They seemed to see right through him, into the very core of his being, and for a moment, John could feel the weight of everything she knew pressing down on him. "Finish it," she repeated, her voice a chilling whisper that echoed in his mind. "The truth is waiting beneath the house. You must decide, leave or die." John's heart raced as the words echoed in his mind. The room seemed to spin, the walls narrowing, and for a brief moment, he thought he might lose control. But something deep inside him fought back the panic. He couldn't let fear take over, not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a cold, twisted smile. "I am the truth," she said, "and the truth is buried beneath the house. You have opened the door, and now you must face what lies beneath." John felt the weight of her words, as if they were a warning, a threat that he could not ignore. He had come here for answers, but now, as the darkness in the room pressed in, he began to realize that the answers he sought might come at a terrible cost. "You must choose," the woman said, her voice growing colder. "Leave this place, and you will live. But if you stay, you will uncover what should never be revealed." John's mind raced. What was buried beneath the house? What was so dangerous that it had been locked away for so long? He could feel the presence in the room, the force that had been haunting him, pressing against him, urging him to make a decision. The woman's figure flickered again, as if she were struggling to maintain her form, her body shifting and warping. She was not entirely human, John realized. She was a manifestation of something far older, far more powerful. Max barked once, his ears flat against his head. John's gaze shifted to the dog. Max was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. The bond between man and dog was unspoken, but in that moment, John understood. Max wasn't just afraid. He was terrified of what lay ahead. But John couldn't turn back now. He had to know the truth. He had to finish what had been started. He turned back to the woman, his eyes steady. "I'll stay," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll face whatever is hidden here." The woman's smile twisted into something darker. "You have made your choice," she said. "Now you will see what lies beneath." With a sudden motion, she vanished, her form dissipating into the shadows. John stood alone in the cold room, the temperature dropping even further, the air now thick with an overwhelming presence. Max whined softly, his eyes darting around the room, But John didn't move. His decision was made. He had to face what was buried beneath this house, and whatever it was, he couldn't back down now. With a deep breath, he turned and moved toward the far end of the basement, where the iron door still stood, half hidden behind the pile of boxes. His hands were steady as he reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than it had been before. He could feel the pulse of energy beneath his fingers, as if the door itself were alive, waiting for him to open it. Max stood behind him, hesitant, but not pulling away. John twisted the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. The moment the door opened, the air grew even colder, and John felt a wave of dread wash over him. He stepped into the room, Max following closely behind, his body tense, his tail low. The room was vast, the darkness stretching out before him like an endless abyss. But in the center of the room, John could make out a shape, something large and heavy, obscured by the shadows. As he moved closer, he saw it, a stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it had not been touched in years. And on the altar, there was something else. A book, ancient and worn, its pages yellowed with age. The book seemed to call to him, its presence heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. John reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the cover. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, a cold shock that made him gasp. The book was alive. He could feel it pulsing in his hands, as if it were waiting for him to open it. Max growled again, his body pressed close to John's legs. But John didn't hesitate. He opened the book, and as the first page turned, the room seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, swirling and stretching as if they were reaching for him. The words on the pages were written in an ancient language, one John could not understand. But as he continued to turn the pages, something strange happened. The words began to shift and change, rearranging themselves until they were in English. The final page sent a chill through his body. The truth lies beneath, it read, and it will never rest until it is free. John felt his breath quicken as he stared at the final words in the ancient book. The truth lies beneath, and it will never rest until it is free. The weight of those words hung in the air, pressing against him, and for a moment, he felt as though the room itself was closing in. Max, standing by his side, let out a low growl, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe, as if they had a life of their own. John's grip tightened on the book, and he slowly turned the page, desperate for more answers. But instead of words, the next page was blank, a pure, white sheet of paper that seemed to mock him. Confused, he flipped through the rest of the pages. They, too, were blank. His heart raced, panic threatening to overtake him. He had come this far, opened the door, and now he was facing the final piece of the puzzle, and it was empty. He stared at the blank pages, a sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. Max barked once, sharply, snapping John out of his trance. The dog's fur bristled, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. John's head snapped up, his breath catching in his throat. The room seemed to shift again, the shadows growing deeper, colder. The walls of the basement groaned, the sound of creaking wood and shifting stone filling the air. It felt as though the entire house was awakening, its bones creaking with life. The book in John's hands began to vibrate, a low, steady hum emanating from its pages. The blank pages began to flicker, and for a brief moment, John saw something in the words. Not words, but symbols, strange, twisted markings that seemed to pulse with energy. They moved across the page, rearranging themselves, shifting and morphing into something new. John couldn't take his eyes off them, his body frozen in place. The symbols were ancient, far older than anything he had ever encountered. They seemed to call to him, beckoning him forward. And then, as if in response to his gaze, the symbols rearranged again, forming a phrase that burned into his mind. To awaken the truth, you must sacrifice what is dear to you. A cold chill ran through him. Sacrifice? What did it mean? His eyes flicked to Max, who was now standing rigid, watching the darkness in the far corner of the room. The dog's body trembled, his hackles raised. John's mind raced. What was he supposed to do? What could he sacrifice? The feeling of dread grew stronger, and for the first time, John felt truly afraid. The house, the symbols, the woman's warning. All of it pointed to something he couldn't understand, something he wasn't ready to face. The room seemed to shift again, the shadows growing longer, deeper, as though the very walls were pulling him into them. The air was thick with a suffocating presence. Max barked again, more urgently this time, his eyes wide with fear. John looked around, his heart pounding. The darkness in the corner was moving. Something was coming, something that had been waiting for him. He turned quickly, his mind racing. But before he could react, the shadows leapt toward him. A scream tore through the silence as the darkness enveloped him, thick and suffocating. The air turned icy cold, and for a brief moment, John thought he would suffocate. But then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure lifted. He was standing in the center of the room, the shadows retreating into the corners. Max stood beside him, panting heavily, his eyes still filled with fear. The room had changed. The walls were now cracked, the floor splintered, as though the very foundation of the house had been shaken to its core. The book in John's hands was no longer glowing, but its weight had increased. The sense of dread was overwhelming now, and John knew, deep in his bones, that he had made a terrible mistake. "What is this place?" he whispered to no one, the words falling from his lips. Like an invocation. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift once more. The floor beneath him cracked, and a low rumble filled the air. From the depths below, John could hear something stirring, something ancient, something powerful. Max growled again, his body low to the ground, his eyes locked on the center of the room. A strange sound, like a low, hollow growl, echoed through the basement. The walls trembled as if something immense was moving beneath the house, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. John stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. The house was alive, and it was waking up. The truth that had been buried beneath the floorboards was now stirring, and there was no escaping it. He had come to uncover the mystery, but now he realized that he was the one who had awakened it, and there was no turning back. The ground beneath John's feet trembled, and the walls of the basement groaned as if the house itself was shifting. Max stood beside him, growling fiercely, his body rigid with fear. John could feel the heavy presence pressing in from all sides, the air growing thick and cold. The rumbling sound intensified, growing louder, deeper, as if something immense was awakening from its long slumber. It was as though the very foundation of the house was coming undone. The book in John's hands felt as if it was pulsing with energy, the weight of it pressing against his palms. He could feel the power emanating from the pages, a power that had been locked away for centuries. The symbols that had once flickered on the pages now seemed to glow, swirling and shifting as if alive. Max barked again, but this time, it was a frantic, desperate bark, the kind of sound that only came when an animal knew something was horribly wrong. John's heart raced. The air felt charged with an overwhelming sense of dread. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get out of this house before it consumed him. But he couldn't leave. Not now. He had come too far, and the truth, whatever it was now right in front of him. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the entire house. The floor cracked beneath John's feet, and he staggered, grabbing onto the nearest support beam to steady himself. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twisting and writhing like living things. John looked around, trying to find some explanation, but everything was too much, too overwhelming. Then, a voice that was not human, whispered in his mind, cold and distant. "You have released it. Now you will face it." The words echoed in his head, filling him with a sense of terror that threatened to paralyze him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Only Max, standing his ground, his eyes wide with fear. The rumbling intensified, and John realized that the house was no longer just shifting. It was moving, as though something beneath it was trying to break free. The walls cracked again, and with a deafening roar, the floorboards beneath them splintered open, revealing a deep, black abyss. Max yelped and backed away, his body shaking. John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The hole in the floor stretched wide, and from the darkness below, something stirred. Something that had been buried for far too long. John's pulse quickened. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around him felt heavy with a presence, a malevolent force that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. "What is it?" John muttered to himself, his voice shaky. He knew he had to make a choice. He could run, leave the house and never look back. But he also knew that if he did, he would never have the answers. The truth, as terrifying as it was buried beneath the house, and it was calling to him. He had no choice. He had to face it. With a deep breath, John stepped toward the gaping hole in the floor, his hand still clutching the book. The rumbling subsided for a moment, and for a brief second, there was silence. But then, from the abyss, a dark shape began to rise. It was like a shadow, formless and massive, stretching up toward him. The air around it seemed to warp and bend, and as it rose, the temperature in the room dropped even further until John could see his breath in the freezing air. Max barked again, a frantic, desperate sound, but John couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadow. It seemed to be made of darkness itself, its form constantly shifting, as if it were not fully of this world. The whispers grew louder, the same chilling voice that had spoken to him earlier. "You have awakened it," the voice said, its tone cold and full of malice. "Now, you will serve it." John's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the presence, pressing against him from all sides. The shadow continued to rise, taking form, until it was standing before him, towering and monstrous. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were pools of darkness, voids that seemed to swallow everything around them. John took a step back, but the shadow moved with him, its form shifting, blocking his escape. It reached out with long, shadowy tendrils, wrapping around the air like twisted fingers. "No!" John shouted, his voice filled with panic. But the shadow's grip tightened, pulling him closer, dragging him toward the darkness. The book in his hands seemed to hum, its pages trembling with an energy that felt alive. The whispers were deafening now, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. "You must face the truth," the voice whispered again, louder this time, a command. John struggled, trying to break free, but the tendrils of the shadow held him fast. The book glowed with a blinding light, and for a moment, John thought he might lose himself in the darkness. But then, something inside him snapped. He could feel the presence inside the book, the energy that had been waiting to be unleashed. He wasn't just holding the book anymore. It was holding him, guiding him, forcing him to confront the truth. With a cry, he opened the book wide. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment John opened the book, the world around him seemed to implode. The air itself seemed to warp, twisting and distorting, as if reality was being torn apart at its seams. The dark figure, the shadow that had once towered before him, shrieked in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices combined, each one filled with rage and terror. John could feel the power of the book surging through him, a force so intense that it burned through his veins like fire. The light from the pages grew brighter, blinding him, until the entire room seemed to vanish in a flash of white. For a moment, everything was silent. The oppressive darkness, the cold air, the shadows, they were gone, replaced by a vast, infinite nothingness. John couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The book, now glowing with a radiant light, pulsed in his hands. And then, as if from nowhere, a voice spoke. It was a deep, ancient voice that echoed through the void, reverberating in John's mind. "You have broken the seal," it said. "Now you will face the consequence of your actions." John's heart raced as he struggled to understand what was happening. He was no longer in the basement, no longer in the house. He was suspended in the void, surrounded by an endless expanse of nothingness. The book in his hands throbbed with power, its light growing ever brighter. The voice continued, "The truth you seek is not without price. The darkness that was buried is now free, and it will seek its vengeance. You are its vessel, its chosen one." John's grip on the book tightened, the weight of the words crashing down on him. He could feel the presence of the darkness closing in, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. But he couldn't move. The voice, no longer speaking to him but through him, began to speak again, its tone now filled with malice. "You will carry the darkness within you, John. It will feed on your fear, your regrets, your guilt. It will grow stronger until it consumes you completely." Panic surged through John as he struggled to break free, but the darkness held him in place, its tendrils wrapping around his body like chains. The book in his hands began to vibrate, its light flickering like a dying flame. The presence of the darkness grew stronger, its whispers filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. "No," John shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "I won't let it take me." The void seemed to stretch further, and the shadows around him grew darker, more tangible. He could feel the darkness reaching inside of him, touching the deepest corners of his soul. His heart raced as the weight of the presence pressed against him. But even as the darkness swirled around him, John knew that he couldn't give in. He had to fight, had to push back. The book in his hands glowed brighter than ever, and with one final, desperate push, John focused all his willpower on the light. "I will not be your vessel," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I will not let you win." For a moment, the light from the book flickered, and the darkness recoiled, as if it had been wounded. The shadows that had surrounded John began to dissipate, fading away like mist in the wind. But the voice of the darkness, its cold, haunting whisper, lingered in his mind, echoing with a warning. "You have only delayed the inevitable, John. The darkness will always find a way." The words sent a shiver down John's spine, but he refused to let them consume him. He focused on the light, willing it to grow, to overpower the shadows. Slowly, the void around him began to shift, the oppressive darkness lifting, the light from the book expanding until it filled the space. John blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, he was back in the basement, the book still glowing in his hands. Max was by his side, panting heavily, his eyes still wide with fear, but the oppressive presence had vanished. The house was silent now, the walls no longer creaking, the air no longer heavy with malevolent energy. The shadows in the corners of the room had receded, leaving only a dim, quiet stillness. John took a deep breath, the air feeling fresh and clean for the first time in what felt like forever. But the darkness was still there, lingering in the back of his mind, just out of reach. He knew that it wasn't truly gone. He had only bought himself time. And he knew, deep down, that this battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. John stood in the dim light of the basement, the book still glowing faintly in his hands, and Max at his side, trembling from the lingering fear. The air felt thick, as though the house itself was breathing, but there was no longer the overwhelming pressure of darkness that had surrounded him just moments before. The presence had faded, but the silence left behind was unsettling. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. John's heart was still racing, the adrenaline coursing through him as the reality of what had just happened sank in. He had fought it back, this ancient evil that had been waiting for so long to be unleashed. But he knew, deep in his bones, that the battle was far from over. The woman's words echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder that the darkness would always find a way. "You have only delayed the inevitable." He could still feel the weight of her gaze, the coldness in her voice. As much as he wanted to believe that he had won, that he had somehow stopped it, he knew better. The book pulsed in his hands, its pages flickering as though alive. It was no ordinary book. It was a key, a vessel for the force that had been trapped beneath the house for centuries. And now, it was free, still stirring in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. John let out a shaky breath and glanced at Max, whose eyes were wide with fear. The dog, once the calm, loyal companion, had been rattled to his core by the dark presence that had lingered. "It's not over, boy," John muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Max's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but the dog didn't move. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had thought that opening the book would reveal the truth, that it would bring closure. Instead, it had unleashed something far darker, far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The truth was not something to be sought. It was something to be feared. He had been warned, but he had chosen to ignore it. And now, he would have to face the consequences. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in once more, the air growing colder with every passing second. John's breath formed a mist in front of him as the temperature continued to drop. The ground beneath him trembled lightly, as though the house was waking from a deep slumber. He had to act. Whatever had been buried in this house, whatever had been awakened, would not rest until it had consumed everything in its path. John turned, walking toward the basement stairs, the book still in his hands. He couldn't leave. Not yet. There were more answers to uncover, more pieces of the puzzle to fit together. And he had to stop whatever had been set in motion before it was too late. Max followed close behind, his steps cautious, his senses alert to every sound in the house. As they reached the top of the stairs, John glanced back at the basement door, now closed, but the sense of foreboding still lingered. It was like the house had a heartbeat of its own, each thrum reverberating through the walls, through his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting. He walked through the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The house seemed empty now, but John knew better. The house was never truly empty. There was something here, something that had been buried for too long, and it wasn't going to let him leave until it had what it wanted. As he moved toward the front door, the house seemed to resist him, the air growing heavier, thicker with a malevolent presence. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting at the edges of his vision. He paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. Was this it? Was this the end? No, it couldn't be. There was more to uncover, more to face. He had come too far to stop now. Taking a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped outside. The night air was cold, but it felt like a reprieve. The stars were visible in the sky, a comforting sight in the midst of the chaos inside the house. John glanced down at the book in his hands. It was no longer glowing, its pages now a dull, lifeless gray. But he knew that its power was far from gone. It had only paused, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Max stood by his side, looking up at him, his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty John felt in his chest. Together, they walked away from the house, but John knew the darkness wasn't finished with them. It would follow them, haunt them, and he would never be free from its grip until it had consumed everything he loved. He could feel it, the weight of the darkness pressing on his soul, following him into the night. The battle had only just begun. John couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was closing in on him, even as he stood in the quiet night outside the house. The air was still and cold, the stars overhead twinkling like distant, indifferent witnesses to the horrors he had just faced. Max, standing beside him, shifted uneasily, his amber eyes reflecting the same fear that gnawed at John's gut. They had left the house behind, but it felt like they were carrying its weight with them. The truth, whatever it was, had been unearthed. But the cost had been far higher than he had imagined. The book in John's hands felt heavier than ever before, the once glowing pages now a dull, lifeless gray. But he knew it wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before the darkness would return. It always found a way. As John walked away from the house, the oppressive weight of the place seemed to follow him, a shadow that stretched long into the night. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful cry, carrying with it a chill that cut through his coat. Max trotted beside him, occasionally glancing up at John with a worried expression. They reached the edge of the property, the twisted trees that surrounded the house, now standing like silent sentinels in the distance. John stopped for a moment, looking back at the mansion, the dark silhouette against the moonlight. It seemed so still, so abandoned, but he knew better. The house was alive, and it wasn't done with him yet. "We need to get away from here, Max," John murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Max gave a soft whine, as if in agreement, but neither of them moved. The feeling that something was watching them, that something was waiting, grew stronger with every passing second. The darkness was patient. It had waited for centuries, and it would wait again. John's mind raced. He couldn't just run away. He had to stop it, stop whatever had been unleashed. But how? The book had given him no answers, only more questions. What was the truth beneath the house? What was the darkness that had been buried there? And why had it chosen him to be its vessel? He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. But who could he trust? The authorities would never believe him. No one would understand. He had to figure this out, and he had to do it fast. As he turned to walk away, Max suddenly stopped, his nose in the air. The dog sniffed the wind, his body tense, as if sensing something John couldn't. The hairs on the back of John's neck stood up. He turned to look behind him. At first, he saw nothing but the empty landscape of the surrounding woods. But then he saw it. A faint figure moving in the distance, barely visible against the darkness. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. But something was off. The figure moved with an unnatural, jerky motion, as if it wasn't quite in sync with the world around it. John's pulse quickened. The figure was getting closer, moving towards them. He could feel the weight of its presence even from this distance. Max growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice steady but strained. The figure didn't respond. It just kept coming, its movements growing more erratic, more unnatural. John's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, but he knew it wouldn't help. Whatever this was, it wasn't something a bullet would stop. The figure stopped just a few yards away, its face still hidden in the shadows. John could feel its gaze on him, even though he couldn't see its eyes. The air grew colder still, the chills seeping into his bones. "What do you want?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, unmoving, like a silent observer. Max barked once, sharply, and the figure tilted its head slightly, as if noticing the dog for the first time. But then, in a blur of motion, it lunged. John barely had time to react before the figure was upon him, its cold, unnatural hands grabbing hold of his arm. The contact sent a shock through his body, a cold so deep it felt like ice in his veins. John's breath hitched as he struggled to free himself. Max, now snarling, lunged at the figure, biting at its arms, but the creature didn't flinch. It seemed almost impervious to the dog's attacks. "Let go of me," John shouted, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it pulled him closer, dragging him toward the woods. John's mind raced. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. He had to break free. In one final burst of strength, he twisted his body, managing to break free from the creature's grip. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Max stood by his side, ready to protect him. But the figure didn't chase them. It just stood there, watching, waiting. John's mind reeled as he tried to process what had just happened. What was that thing? And why had it attacked him? The figure slowly faded into the darkness, its form becoming indistinguishable from the night around them. John felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had barely escaped. But what had it wanted? And why did it feel so familiar? The book, the darkness, the truth. Everything was starting to come together, but it only raised more questions. Whatever had been buried beneath the house, whatever had been awakened, it was far more than John could have ever imagined. John couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had faced, everything he had endured, had only led to this moment. The darkness, the house, the figures that had appeared before him, and the book, all of it was just a beginning, not an end. The figure in the woods, the one that had attacked him, was the last straw. It had been a warning, a final push to make him understand that there was no escaping the truth that lay beneath. He looked down at the book still clutched in his hands, the pages now eerily still, but he could feel its weight. It wasn't just an artifact. It was alive, pulling him into its web of secrets. Max, ever loyal, stood at his side, his body tense, his growls low and continuous. But John could feel the shift in the air, the thick silence that was more menacing than any sound could ever be. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It was feeding off the fear and uncertainty that had been stirred in him, pulling him deeper into its grip. "We have to finish this, Max," John muttered, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince more, his dog or himself. They had to go back. They had no choice. The house had waited for so long, and now that it had found its vessel, it wasn't going to let go. John knew it. He could feel it. The darkness was relentless. He and Max made their way back toward the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The night seemed darker, colder, as if the world itself had conspired to make this moment feel as final as possible. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the moonless sky. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards under his boots, every rustle of the leaves in the wind, every shift in the shadows, they all felt like a warning. The door to the house creaked open as he reached it, the air inside thick with the staleness of forgotten time. John stepped in, Max following closely, his eyes darting to the corners of every room, his every muscle taut with fear. The house was still, but it was too still, as if it was waiting for them. The familiar coldness that had gripped the house earlier had returned, but it was deeper now, more consuming. John walked through the hall, and the shadows seemed to move with him, stretching, twisting, reaching out like fingers. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a living entity, and he was trapped inside it. He could feel it watching him, breathing with him, its pulse steady and rhythmic, just like his own. The book in his hands began to glow again, faint at first, but then brighter, pulsing with the same energy that had filled the house. He reached the basement door and hesitated. There was no going back. This was the heart of the house, the source of everything. Whatever had been buried here, whatever had been waiting for him, it would be found. He had to face it. Slowly, he opened the door, the familiar creak sending a shiver down his spine. The basement was just as he remembered it, dark, cold, and oppressive. But there was something else now. The air was thick with a tangible presence, something that felt like it was alive, moving. Max growled low, his ears flattening against his head as they descended into the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, John froze. The altar was there, but it was different now. The book's glow illuminated it, casting long, haunting shadows across the room. The symbols on the floor, the ones he had seen in the book, now seemed to pulse with life. He could feel the air crackling with energy, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to hum, vibrating with power. Max let out a sharp bark, and John turned to see the shadows shifting, moving, coalescing into a shape. A figure. The woman from the house, the one who had warned him, was standing before him. But she wasn't the same. Her form was more solid now, more defined, and her eyes were no longer sad but full of fury. "You have awakened what should have remained buried," she said, her voice cold and accusing. "You will pay the price." The darkness around them seemed to grow, wrapping around John like a shroud. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with fear. But he couldn't let it win. He couldn't let the house take him, take everything. "No," he said, his voice stronger now, steadier. "I won't let you control me." The woman's form flickered, her eyes burning with rage. "You have no choice," she hissed. "The darkness will consume you. It is already inside you." John tightened his grip on the book. The light from the pages was brighter now, almost blinding, and the power within it surged again. "I am not afraid of you," he said. With one final push, he opened the book to its last page. The symbols on the floor flared to life, glowing with a brilliant light, and the house trembled. The woman screamed, her form disintegrating as the light grew stronger. Max barked fiercely, his eyes locked on the woman's fading form. John could feel the darkness fighting back, but it was too late. The house shook violently, the walls cracking as the light from the book overwhelmed everything. With one final burst, the darkness was pushed back, and the house fell silent. The light faded, and John stood alone, the book now dim and lifeless in his hands. Max stood by his side, panting heavily, his body still tense. The house, once filled with malevolent energy, was now still. John didn't know if it was over, but he knew one thing for certain. He had won. For now, the darkness had been contained, but it would never be truly gone. It would always be there, waiting for its next opportunity. And he would be ready. Because he knew the truth now, the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Veteran stories have a way of drawing us in, capturing the essence of strength, perseverance, and the haunting legacies of battles fought both in the world and within. In this gripping tale, a battle-worn veteran finds himself trapped in a house with a dark past, where supernatural forces challenge everything he thought he knew about reality. As he battles through the terrifying events that unfold, the veteran must confront a truth buried beneath the very foundation of the house, a truth that threatens to consume him. With the help of his loyal dog, he faces the darkness that has been waiting for centuries, unleashing a force that has lain dormant for far too long. The chilling presence of the supernatural becomes more intense as the veteran uncovers secrets that were never meant to be revealed, forcing him to make impossible choices. Through twists and turns that only veteran stories can offer, he discovers that the battle isn't just physical, it's mental, emotional, and spiritual. The dark forces that haunt him push him to his breaking point, yet the veteran's resilience shines through, determined to save not only himself but the world around him. As the story unfolds, the supernatural forces bend the very fabric of time and space, and the veteran finds himself facing a battle unlike anything he has faced before. This journey into the unknown reminds us why veteran stories are so powerful. They show us that true courage often comes not just from the battlefield, but from facing the deepest fears within ourselves. With every page turned, the veterans' fight against the darkness intensifies, and the truth becomes more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. These veteran stories are more than just tales of war. They are stories of survival, strength, and the unyielding will to protect what matters most.